Hi, I'm Allison. I am an educator here at Angelic Organics Learning Center. I'm also a vegetable farmer in Rockford, Illinois. So as a food educator, a vegetable farmer, and someone who eats, I'm really interested in talking to people about how they can be incorporating more local food into the way that they eat. And I'm particularly interested in how people can be incorporating more winter foods into their diet in our cold northern climate. So today we are going to roast some winter vegetables, but we're also going to do a little bit of a choose your own adventure so that you can get familiar with how you can roast basically any vegetable. Whatever vegetable ends up on your kitchen counter at any time during the year, you'll feel prepared to roast it by the end of today. Roasting is a great strategy to be incorporating into your kitchen if you're not already, for several reasons. The first one is because we can roast basically any vegetable, a really wide array of vegetables. So here, for example, today we're going to be roasting some leaves, some root vegetables like turnips, hard vegetables like winter squash. We're just covering a lot of different bases today, and there are even more vegetables that aren't represented here that you can also roast. The second reason is because you can cook a whole bunch of vegetables at once by roasting them without having to do them in batches necessarily. Load up a bunch of sheet trays and toss them all into your oven and you'll be done preparing a bunch of vegetables for all week right away. The third reason is because when we introduce heat to a vegetable, it starts to develop some flavor compounds and break down other flavor compounds. And the particular way in which we cook a vegetable changes which flavor compounds are impacted and in which ways. So roasting, in my opinion, produces some of the best flavor results that we can get from cooking a vegetable. The next reason is that heat also breaks down the cell walls of vegetables as well as some other chemicals in the vegetables that can make it hard to digest the food. So by roasting or cooking in some other way, we can make the nutrition in the vegetable more accessible to our bodies. We can also make it easier on our digestive system if eating vegetables is something that is hard on your digestive system. And then finally, roasting vegetables takes basically no equipment at all. So at a minimum, you'll need a cutting board and a knife, and then some sort of oven-safe pan to cook on. Today we're using a sheet pan, and later in this video we'll talk about some other choices that you have. But that's why I think that you should incorporate roasting into what you do in your kitchen. So like I said, today we're doing a little bit of a choose your own adventure for roasting vegetables, and the first choice that you'll need to make is what temperature to set your oven at. So if you're looking for like the easy option, what I recommend is 425 as the temperature for your oven. If you really like a vegetable that's got lots of roasty browning on it, you could bump up that temperature to 450 or even 475, but plan on cooking your vegetables for a shorter amount of time and plan on them being maybe not as soft and well done. If you prefer your vegetables to not have much of any browning on them, like for example, many kids don't like their vegetables to be browned, you might opt for a lower oven temperature somewhere in the ballpark of 375 to 400 would be where to set your oven to, and you can plan on cooking your vegetables for longer if you make that choice. So I'm going to set ours to 425 today. The second choice that we're going to make is which vegetables to use. So when you're talking about the vegetables that you'll roast, they fall into kind of four categories, and I'll show you some examples. So the first category is hard raw vegetables. So that would be things like root vegetables, turnips, carrots, beets, stuff like that. Tubers like potatoes, sweet potatoes. Raw winter squash. Today we have a par-cooked winter squash, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But if your winter squash was raw, that would definitely be a hard vegetable. So basically anything that is meeting like a lot of resistance when you're trying to put a knife through it. The second category of vegetable is kind of softer or par-cooked or pre-cooked, very hard vegetables. So things that fall into that category are things like onions, leeks would also fall into that category. Summer squash is that kind of softer category. Green beans and peas, like snow peas that are in the pod still, fall into that category. And an example of a hard vegetable that's been pre-cooked that falls into that second category is winter squash. If you saw our previous video about how to prepare a winter squash, you'll know that my preferred strategy for working with winter squash is to go ahead and par cook a squash after making just one cut through it. You can see here that we just made one cut and pre-cooked it. It's not cooked all the way, but it is soft now, so that makes it easier to prepare, kind of like a summer squash is easier to prepare. The next category of vegetable is juicy vegetables. So primarily we would think of tomatoes in this category, and the reason why they belong in their own category is because you might want to cook them very briefly. You might want large pieces cooked very briefly so that they retain that juicy kind of freshness, or you might want to cook them for a really long time to get rid of a lot of that juiciness and make them really roasty and deeply flavored. Another juicy vegetable is actually fungi, mushrooms. They also have a lot of moisture in them that we can choose to either cook out or cook for a long time by cooking for a long time, or to not cook out by cooking for a short time. Then the last category is leaves. So today we've got some baby kale that we're using as our leaves, and any green, with the exception of lettuce, I wouldn't roast lettuce, can be a green that you roast, but also you might think about things like green onions or basil leaves, other herb leaves. You can treat those like your baby greens or mature greens as well. And then today we also have garlic, which I think of as its own special thing. We leave our garlic, or at least I leave my garlic, in its whole heads when I roast it. The reason why is that if you chop up your garlic, if you mince it like you would for other recipes, or if you take the cloves out of their wrappers to roast them, those are really small pieces, and garlic has a lot of sugars in them. So they would be really prone to burning if we did it that way. By leaving it in the whole heads, the garlic gets soft and roasty inside the cloves, and then we can just snip off the end of the cloves and squeeze out that roasty garlic paste from the cloves. It makes it really easy to work with, and really, really cuts down on the risk of burning your garlic. So those are some of the different types of vegetables you can choose. To roast just one type of vegetable, you could do an entire sheet tray of just radishes or just green beans if you had an abundance from your garden or a CSA or something like that. Or you could do just a little bit of a whole bunch of different kinds of vegetables. So for example, maybe you had a bunch of vegetables that you were using for some recipes during the week and you had some leftovers of each of the kinds. Put them all on the sheet tray together. That's a-okay too. And then of course, anywhere between those two ends of the spectrum is also good. All right, the next choice that you're going to need to make is how to chop up your vegetables. And the first rule of thumb that you'll want to follow for this is that the larger the piece of vegetable, the more slowly that it's going to cook. Smaller pieces cook faster and will get softer faster. So we'll start with our turnip here. Remove the top, remove the roots. I am going to use a vegetable peeler to peel it, but you could use the knife if that's what you have. So turnips are generally something that we would want in relatively small pieces because generally speaking, we want our turnip pieces to be pretty well cooked. So something like this is usually a pretty good size for turnips. These are relatively small pieces that will cook relatively quickly. All right, we'll chop more turnip later, but we'll set it aside for now. Something like a potato is also a hard vegetable, and we know that hard vegetables, the second rule of thumb, will cook more slowly than soft vegetables. So just like we wanted small turnip pieces, we also want small potato pieces because they also are hard vegetables that cook more slowly. our par-cooked winter squash are examples of softer vegetables from that second category of softer vegetables. And so bigger pieces can be good for these softer vegetables because softer vegetables cook more slowly or cook more quickly, sorry. So what we might do is cut our winter squash into wedges. Remove the skin by carefully sliding the knife between the skin and the flesh. And cut it into larger pieces, but still not huge pieces, than the turnip. So smaller turnip pieces because it's harder and we want it really well done. Bigger winter squash pieces because that's a softer vegetable because it was par cooked, and we maybe don't need it quite as well done. With the onions, these are another example of a softer vegetable. So we could choose to, again, use smaller pieces like we did for the winter squash, but I also know that something about myself is that I prefer my onions to be very well done. And because I know that I want them to be more well done than the other vegetables on my tray, I'm going to choose to cut them into extra thin slices so that they cook faster. So here are some really thin onion slices because I like mine that way, but if you like your onions to retain a little bit of raw onion bite even after they've been cooked, make bigger slices. Next, we need to think about our leaves. Leaves, because they have a lot of water in them, will shrink down a lot when we roast them. So usually opting for a bigger piece is a good idea because they'll shrink down to bite-sized pieces when we roast them. Something about this size is about right to roast. You could also tear bigger leaves in pieces like this, or tear them so that you can remove the central stalk if there's kind of a more fibrous stalk in the leaves that you have. But with leaves, we know that they cook really quickly compared to other things. So they'll both shrink down a lot and cook very fast. So usually when we're including leaves in our roasted vegetables, we want to kind of set them aside and add them to our pan toward the end of cooking, maybe even in the last 5 minutes of cooking, so that they don't cook too much before everything else is done. And then like we talked about earlier with the garlic, we're going to leave it in its whole heads instead of breaking it into cloves, but we will remove some of this extra papery skin from the outside, especially if yours, like mine, comes to you with a little bit of soil still on it. We can also trim off these roots now if we want to. Scissors would probably be the best tool for that. I'm gonna leave mine on though because it doesn't bother me. So that would just go onto the sheet tray just like this. All right, I'm gonna prepare the rest of my vegetables and then we'll be ready to talk about the next choice. All right, our next choice is what kind of baking pan to use and how to arrange our vegetables on the baking pan. So this is a sheet pan that doesn't have a dark nonstick surface on it, and that's like a good baseline pan to use. You can see that I've got things spaced out pretty far apart, which means that they're going to cook faster than they would if they were like scrunched together or like on top of each other. So the cooking times that I'm going to give in a couple minutes are for this kind of arrangement. Vegetables spread pretty far apart on a metal pan that doesn't have a dark coating. But you might have other pans, right? So one other pan that you might be using is a metal pan with a dark nonstick coating on it. The dark coating means that things will cook faster, so you would want to cook for a shorter time than I'm going to give you. The next pan that you might choose to use is a ceramic baking dish. In a ceramic baking dish, both the material of the dish is going to make things take longer to cook because it doesn't reflect the heat the way that a metal pan does, but also there's less surface area in a pan like this than there is on our baking sheet, which means that probably if you're putting the same amount of vegetables as you would on the baking sheet, they're going to be piled on top of each other or touching each other, and that will make them take longer to cook. So if you're using a pan like this, again, you're going to want to use a longer time than I suggest to you in this video. You might also be baking in a clear baking dish, a clear glass baking dish. Again, like with the ceramic, it's a slower cooking in the glass, probably even slower than in the ceramic actually. And this one has very little surface area, so your vegetables are really going to be heaped in here. So of the options that we've got here today, this is the kind of dish that would require the longest cooking time. Our last choice is about seasoning. So when you're thinking of roasting vegetables, you might think about putting every vegetable together in a bowl and then coating the entire bowl of material with your oil and your seasonings, and that is totally an option. But especially if you're a beginner to roasting, I like to suggest that you arrange your vegetables like this, where each type is in its own section. Because that means that if something cooks faster than you were expecting to, you can go ahead and remove just that one type of vegetable while everything else keeps cooking, which just gives you a little bit more leeway if you're just trying some stuff out. So what that means is that we're not going to be able to put everything in the same bowl to season it all at once. You could put each individual type of vegetable in its own bowl and season each type of vegetable in a bowl, but that would create a lot of dishes, and I don't like creating a lot of dishes. So what I like to do is season just directly on the pan. Once everything is arranged how you want it, you can use your oil bottle. This one has a big opening and pours fast, so I'm going to use my thumb on the edge of the bottle to slow the pour and just drizzle some drops of oil on. It doesn't have to be coated perfectly. There. So we've just got a little bit of oil on all of our vegetables. I didn't worry about getting any on our garlic because it doesn't really need it or benefit from it because the outer paper is going to come off later anyway. Next, today we're just doing a simple salt and pepper seasoning. You can use whatever seasonings you like. You can make it spicy with cayenne pepper powder or chili flakes. You could use herbs like rosemary, oregano, thyme. Whatever seasonings you like on your vegetables, feel free to add them here. But we're just gonna keep it simple with salt and pepper today. So I just take pinches, and for this amount of vegetable that we have here, somewhere in the ballpark of half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of salt is about right. If you know that you like things salty, opt for the kind of higher end of that spectrum. If you don't prefer your vegetables to be salty, or if you are trying to avoid more salt in your diet, you can use less. Too. And then for the pepper, this is obviously completely to taste. I love black pepper, so I'm going to use quite a bit actually. This is coming up very slowly, far too slowly for my black pepper preferences. All right, and again, we didn't bother doing any seasoning to the garlic. You'll notice that our kale isn't on the tray yet. That's because, like we discussed, it's going to cook super fast compared to these other things. So what I'll do is I'll season in this bowl and then I'll put it on the tray in the last few minutes of baking. All right, so our sheet had pretty small pieces and no vegetable that was really hard. So we're going to start checking on ours at about 20 minutes. If you were roasting something that included a very hard vegetable like a raw sweet potato or a raw winter squash, or if your pieces were much bigger than the ones that we're working with here, then you might wait until about 30 minutes to start checking on your vegetables for doneness. And then keep in mind all of those adjustments that we talked about throughout this video that might make your cooking times longer or shorter, just depending on which choices you made. All right, so we've got our seasoned kale and it's in the last few minutes of the cooking time on our other roasted vegetables, so we're ready to add the kale to our tray now. Things are looking good. Our onions are browned. Everything's looking soft and crisping up a little bit. I'm actually going to put the kale on top of the onions because they're actually looking a little too browned, and putting the kale on top of them will protect them from getting more browned. But if your onions needed a little bit more browning time, you would just put the kale off to the side. There. Look at the kale being so helpful. And then it just goes back into the oven. I say we need maybe another 3 to 5 minutes. I'll check on it after 3, and then every couple minutes after that if I feel like it needs more time. All right, it's been a few more minutes, and our kale is looking good. It started to brown a little bit. It's shrunk up a little bit. And all of the other vegetables are looking good too. So that's our winter vegetable sheet pan roast for today. We're going to use these ingredients to assemble our salad in the next video, but you could also use these just as they are as a side dish. You could use them as ingredients in any sort of meal that you're preparing, like a pasta dish or a chili or something like that. You could also use some sorts of roasted vegetables like roasted peppers or roasted tomatoes as the base for certain kinds of preserves, especially in the summer. That can be a good strategy. So regardless of how you're using your roasted vegetables, I hope that you are finding it delicious and a great, easy way to incorporate more seasonal vegetables into your kitchen.